Sup homies, it's Garage. It's not easy being the world's only good political philosopher. When I'm not revolutionizing political discourse, I'm grappling with the fact that I'm the only one capable of making a political model complex enough to map every single ideology that could possibly exist onto political spectrums and all the ones that can't. That's why I'm unveiling my 100 axes political model. 100 separate axes that measure different political inclinations. You can use combinations of these axes to make up ideologies. You can mix and match these spectrums to describe already existing ideologies, or you can use them to make your own. Now, why are there 100 spectrums, you ask? You may say that this is just a needlessly large number that you're just picking to be flashy and doesn't actually have any utility at all. This is slander. It's actually because the more spectrums that exist within a political model, the cooler that model is. That's right, fellas. I hate to break this to you, but if you've just been identifying as left-wing or right-wing your entire life, then your political philosophy is essentially as deep as a horizontal line. The only solution? Place yourself on 100 different spectrums. Then you'll have a personality. I just want to make it so that the 3 unironic Pasadists that are out there have enough material to infight with each other about. If you've been around this channel for a while, then you probably already know the first 4 axes that I'm going to list. The first spectrum is the economic spectrum. On the economic far left, you have communism, where you've eliminated the need for wealth entirely because everybody's starved to death. And on the economic far right, you have a kind of world where Jeff Bezos has cloned himself 10 million times and has just paid everybody to suck his dick. And like all the pleasure receptors just goes into this big, massive Jeff Bezos brain that just like orgasms a million times. The second spectrum is the cultural spectrum. It's a very similar idea to the economic spectrum when faced versus the economic left and economic right, and the cultural left and the cultural right. Cultural left wants to redistribute and kind of like open up places in culture and society for more kinds of people. The cultural right wants to close up more and more areas and then concentrate the cultural power within the hands of fewer people. If you think more kinds of people deserve more kinds of equality, you're probably more culturally left. If you think that less kinds of people deserve less kinds of equality and you kind of like balk at the idea of equality, you're probably more culturally right. I normally conflate the cultural axes with things like a multiculturalism versus assimilationism, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to chop all that up into other axes. The third spectrum is the governmental axis. So this is kind of how you want your ideals to be enforced. Do you want a state to enforce these ideals, or do you think everybody should just act this way? On the far end of the state spectrum, you have stuff like authoritarianism and totalitarianism. In case you don't know the difference between those two terms, totalitarianism, the state has complete control over the personal lives of each individual within the state, and they really don't have much of a personal life, an ability to make their own choices and have their own agency. An authoritarian regime still has a strong state, but they're a little more hands-off. People who are in the state can make their own decisions a little bit more, and as long as the people in power keep their power, then the individual citizens are more safe off than a totalitarian regime. Totalitarian regimes include Nazi Germany and Mao Zedong's China, and authoritarian regimes are more like Syria's Assad. Okay, so then on the libertarian end, you have people who want less state control in general. You know about libertarians, so let's go even further. On the cusp of anarchy and libertarianism, we have something called monarchism. Monarchists want the smallest possible state that's like feasible. They call it a night watchman state, where just the very, very bare essentials of what is essentially needed to run a society is provided by a state, and then everything else is just completely libertarian. Oh, sorry, hold on, that was the minarchists. The minarchists actually just want anarchy in Minecraft. And then you've got anarchy, which is the complete abolishment of the state, and depending on who you're asking, also all unjust hierarchies. But then, my boys, my pals, you can go even further and get something called ultra-anarchy. So, the thing is, anarchy still allows for some forms of government. Anarcho-communists want to self-govern with a commune, where they would just meet with the individuals of the community and everybody would basically get a say, in a kind of like a direct democracy sort of way. So there would still be government, but it wouldn't be a state. If you want to go beyond that, you would reject all forms of governance as well, which would inherently put you at odds with all kinds of communism and working with other people. And this is more post-left territory. So, for example, Max Stirner would say that government of any kind is a spook, and spooks, down with spooks. My Max Stirner, And Max Stirner was racist, and spook is a racial slur. And I'm going to cut this. We're going to cut this out. The fourth spectrum is time. Now, some people will try to tell you that time is in the fourth dimension. Those people are wrong. If you zoom out and look at time as like a line, then you can see that there's two dimensions. There's two directions in a timeline. You can go backwards, you can go forwards. We're always moving forwards in time, but the past is just as real to us as the present that we were traveling forwards into. So the reason I bring that up is because you can plot somebody's course, you can plot somebody's like direction politically over time by using the fourth dimension. Imagine you slide the fourth dimensional slider and you see how people's cultural, economic, and statist values change as that slider goes from the beginning of their life to the end of their life. For example, just last year I was now I'm a star. The fifth spectrum is the tame/wacky spectrum. This spectrum dictates how wacky an ideology is. For example, communism and fascism, I would say, not that wacky. But Poseidism, which is communism, but we nuke the world in order to bring it about, it's pretty wacky. And anarcho-fascism, which is the exaltation of the state within an anarchist commune, is it's wacky. The 6th through 9th spectrums are different accelerationist and decelerationist spectrums. You have the cultural accelerationist spectrum, the economic accelerationist spectrum, and the technological accelerationist spectrum. For example, on the de-acceleration side of technology, you have anarcho-primitivists, who are essentially Luddites that want to stop the flow of technology because they think that it's damaging to humans as a whole. And then on the other end, you have transhumanists who want to accelerate the process of technology to the point where they can finally get that robot dick they've always wanted. There exists economically left-wing accelerationists who believe in communism but think that the way to do that is to endorse the free market to the point that it collapses, and then from the rubble of that collapse build the communism out of that. Which made sense like 100 years ago, but since then people have caught on that capitalism doesn't stop, it just kind of keeps chugging along. Hey kid, wanna go fast? Pop your wheels. I made a video on cultural accelerationism called The Reverse Ethno-State. The 10th spectrum is esoteric versus materialistic. If you've never heard the term esoteric before when it applies to politics, that's because you're just not as smart as me. Esotericism, to my best understanding, is about the spirit and like non-materialistic things, as opposed to materialistic things in the physical, real world. This is an example of a spectrum that fascism is on one side of and communism is on the opposing end, or at least Marxism, I would say. Because if you look at fascism, what they're trying to do is they're trying to rebuild a kind of mythology, a spirit. They're trying to give a rebirth to their cultural past by exalting the state. And if you look at communism, so that's a very spiritual thing, and you often hear the term esoteric fascism a lot. That's because Julius Evola was a person who thought that, he was so fascist, he thought that the Nazis were like too progressive. He basically said that the spirit of the white man was superior to the spirits of those inferior races. And as a result, he was an esoteric fascist because his fascism wasn't based, his race-based fascism. It wasn't based on genetics as much as it was on like the substance, the spiritual substrate of the human. If you look at what Marx says about materialistic conditions, it's the exact opposite. He's not concerned about the spirit. He's not concerned about the revival of the people. He's only concerned about what he defines as materialistic conditions. So what's really happening. So that's kind of another dichotomy between communism and fascism. And it's another reason to cringe every time someone compares the two as like the same thing. I have dreams some nights. I awaken to Marx staring at me from the top of my bed. He crawls down, looks me in the eye and says, "Material conditions." I say, "Marx, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about." He says, "Material conditions." It's all about the workers' material conditions. I say, Marx, you're freaking me out. He says material conditions. You gotta repeat it, material conditions. I say material conditions, material conditions. And I just say it until he leaves me alone. Okay, now let's make the cultural spectrum more granular. So here's a bunch of different spectrums dictating how much power should be given or taken away to certain groups of people. For example, if your perception is that these people have disadvantages in society, then we should be giving them certain power to make them more equal, if that's what your goal is, equality. These are all different groups of people that intersectional feminists would say are oppressed. Unfortunately for intersectional feminists, just because you're oppressed in one area doesn't mean you get along with everybody who's also oppressed. That's why we need different spectrums for each of these groups. Because, for example, a black person can be black inclusive but trans exclusive. A trans person might be trans inclusive but non-binary exclusive. And there's nothing stopping a non-binary person from being non-binary inclusive but then black person exclusive. It's like rock, paper, scissors, and the black guy is the rock and the trans woman is scissors? Cut this one too. Those are all just examples, of course. I mean, like, a Hispanic person could technically be Hispanic exclusive, even though they are Hispanic themselves, and that's what intersectional feminists would call internalized patriarchy, and what Darwinists would call natural selection. Gays and other members of the LGBT community can pick on bis for not being gay enough. Trans exclusionary radical feminists can be very matriarchal, but then not trans inclusive, etc., etc. You get the gist. I myself am a proud ageist because I don't think boomers should get a say in anything, ever. This can potentially go on infinitely, but I just want to keep it at 10. As a liberal-minded centrist, in my opinion, the only important axis on this graph is the bottom one, where you think about how inclusive am I being to the people who hate everybody on this list? The 21st axis is the extreme axis. Yeah! The extreme axis is important because you can be very far to the edges of a lot of political axes, but still have a relatively tame, relatively non-extreme ideology. The personal political violence axis dictates how much personal political violence an individual is expected or encouraged to inflict personal political violence with their ideology. So, for example, a lot of anarchists are down to throw some Molotovs at banks, maybe punch a few Nazis, and on the other end of the spectrum, there's a few, let's say, culturally right-wing accelerationists who are willing to do more than that. The 23rd axis is the morality versus amorality spectrum. So of note, this isn't good versus evil, this is moral versus amoral. So some ideologies specifically make a claim to morality. For example, a theocracy says that God is with them, but an amoral political ideology is completely foregoing morality in general. So things like anarcho-nihilism, for example, would never make a claim to morality. The 24th spectrum is collectivism versus individualism. So you might think that this is very similar to the totalitarian versus anarchy spectrum. The anarchists are, of course, individualists, and the totalitarians are, of course, group thinkers. But you can actually be a collectivist anarchist. For example, the anarcho-communists want to create collectives of individuals, or you could even be an individualist totalitarian in a weird way, if you think that it's best for you as an individual to create a totalitarian state. Even Max Stirner, who is one of the most individualist political thinkers, still talks about creating unions of egoists, which is basically just a way of saying we're gonna organize, but we're gonna do it in a cool way where we're all still individuals. Ooh. The 25th axis is the ability for this ideology to exist in alternate timelines. For example, syndicalism might be real in some far-off, weird, alternate universe. The 26th axis is the anime axis. On one end of the spectrum you have most extremists who watch a lot of anime, and on the other end of the spectrum you have disdain for weebs. The 27th axis is foreign military policy. Hawks on one end of the spectrum like to use direct military intervention as quick as they can, while doves try to use non-military intervention and more pacifistic approaches. Grab a nuke, you dove cucks! The 28th axis is foreign affairs in general. So basically, this is how much you want your country to be involved at all with things that are happening abroad. The difference between neoconservatives and paleoconservatives is paleoconservatives typically don't care about what's going on abroad, while neoconservatives love getting involved. This is why Tucker Carlson wants to desperately eat out Tulsi Gabbard. The 29th axis is how much you think billionaires should pay taxes. Me personally, I put it at 0. They won't need to pay taxes after we guillotine them. 30th axis is about inheritance. On one end of the spectrum, people's parents can give them all the advantages that they ever want in life. And on the other end of the spectrum, there would be some kind of totalitarian state that takes children away from their parents so that everyone grows up in exactly equal conditions and no one gets an advantage in that way. The 31st spectrum is about control over wealth. Does the state control where the money goes, or does the individual control where the money goes? A state capitalist society will work in tandem with the free markets, so that they're economically right-wing, but the state is still in control of where the money flows. Where in an anarcho-capitalist society, it's the individual who is in control of where the money flows, and big businesses. The 32nd spectrum is how much believers of this ideology are in regret. Me personally, I am not even 1/3 done this video, so I'm here. The 33rd spectrum is the environmental axis. You may associate the left with environmental protection, and that's certainly true in America, but it's not a rule. You can definitely be a leftist that is terrible to the environment, and a right-winger that ends up being very good for the environment. This is why you have stuff like eco-fascism. Fascism is a radical right-wing ideology, but you can still be environmentally friendly while killing all the minorities. Fun fact, eco-fascists have a better and more coherent plan for the environment than centrists do. So, great. The 34th through 40th spectrums are the eugenics spectrums. On the left, you want these kinds of people to be having more babies, and on the right, you want these kinds of people to be having less babies. On the far right, you would want to breed out this person entirely. For example, if you want to see less yucky poor people on the street, then you might support a government program that pays poor people to get sterilized, which would be a form of economic eugenics. Then there's classics like racial eugenics and sterilizing the mentally ill. Haha, humanity is my favorite species. The 41st spectrum is the natalist spectrum, and is more of a broad version of the last few spectrums. It basically says, how many kids do you think people should be having in general across the world at this point in time? On the far left of the spectrum, we have people who are anti-natalists, who think that just being born is a great injustice and that we shouldn't be doing that to anybody else. And on the far right of the spectrum, we have people who are wrong because the other side was right. The 42nd spectrum is the IQ spectrum. This dictates how intelligent a person who believes this ideology is. For example, followers of anti-centrism are on the high end over here, and near the bottom end we have 85 IQ, which is the IQ of most black people, and the IQ of most people who use this statistic unironically. The 43rd spectrum is how sad proponents of this ideology are. For example, neoliberals, they're always having a blast, those fuckers. The 44th spectrum is the anxiety spectrum, how anxious and afraid followers of this ideology are. For example, ideologies that predict the end of the world coming soon are typically a bunch of twitchy, anxious people. The 45th spectrum is the technological threat spectrum. This dictates how much of a threat you think technology is to humanity. For example, anarcho-primitivists are on the far left because they think that technology should be avoided because it is the root of all evil. But it's possible to be on the far right and still encourage ideology. Nick Land, for example, is a right-wing accelerationist who thinks that you should advance technology very quickly, despite the fact that he thinks that technology will eventually consume humanity and there will be very little to call human after it does. So it's like, yes, it's damaging, but I still want to accelerate it. So that's why we have this spectrum. The 46th spectrum is how likely this ideology is to work in one of the upper dimensional impossible universes where gravity falls up and there is no technical mass and everything's just a big blob of cosmic force. The 47th spectrum is the possible versus impossible spectrum. For example, we know that neoliberalism is possible because it's currently the dominant ideology. Maybe even a little too possible. But something like anti-gravitationalism, which seeks to reverse the flow of gravity upwards, well, that's obviously an impossible ideology. Or is it? The 48th spectrum is how correct your opinions on the Soviet Union are. For example, I'm over here on the right end of the spectrum, and everybody else is over here because they're wrong. The 49th spectrum is, has real X been tried? So has the real version of your ideology been put into practice? A lot of communists say that real communism has never been tried. Or some communists might say that real communism has been tried, and that Maoist China or North Korea are very close examples of it. The 50th spectrum is my will to live at this point in the video. The 51st spectrum... The 52nd spectrum... I think what I lack most is community. I'm very isolated here. I don't have as many friends as I thought I would. It turns out being a success doesn't mean anything if you don't have anybody to share it with. The 53rd spectrum is utopian versus dystopian. Do you want society to progress towards a dystopia or a utopia? The 54th spectrum is doomer versus bloomer. Doomer philosophies are built upon the expectation of total societal collapse, whether or not they actually want that societal collapse or not. And then the bloomer philosophy is built on an optimistic projection for the future. For example, neoliberalism is kind of a bloomer philosophy because it's saying that we will invent new technologies to deal with the environmental and cultural and ecological disaster that we're doing to the planet, and we'll invent jobs for automation and blah 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 blah. The doomers who don't want to live in a dystopia are often depressed, and the bloomers are typically happy, optimistic people. And they should be. Everything's gonna be fine. Everything's gonna be fine. Everything's gonna be fine. Do you find that the air is thinner ever since the Amazon burned down? The 55th spectrum is the question: if this ideology was a person, would I fuck them? For example, I would absolutely hate fucking Nazbol, but I would probably not go near a social democrat or conservative. The 56th spectrum is the question: if this ideology was a person, would it be my friend? And if it was my friend, would it come visit me? Would it guide me through problems in life, and would it call me up sometimes and the two of us could have chats? Would it tell me that it's okay to be alone because it's here with me? The answer is, of course, yes. The 57th spectrum is: why are all of your videos for help? Why are all your videos for help? The 58th spectrum is how likely proponents of this ideology are to be on some kind of intoxicant. For example, Esoteric Fascism by Julius Evola. Julius Evola was on probably psychedelics a lot of the time, which is why he could see the spirits of the races. But you'll also see a lot of anarcho-communists doing lots of drugs, anarcho-capitalists doing cocaine and stuff because they don't want the government to tell them what drugs they can and can't buy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have conservatives who are pretty unlikely to do anything besides alcohol. The 59th spectrum is how likely proponents of this ideology are to smoke. For example, absurdists want to be like their best friend Albert Camus, so they'll be smoking all the time and thus give themselves lung cancer. Just like Camus, dead. The 60th spectrum is how likely people with this ideology are to read political theory. For example, I have never read a book on political theory in my life, but I'm still going to lecture you about political theory like I know anything about it. The 61st axis is the praxis versus theory axis. Some ideologies are entirely about doing something. For example, anti-fascism isn't really an ideology so much as it is a thing that you do. So we could say that anti-fascism is pure praxis, but then we could say anarcho-communism, which is often the philosophy that informs anti-fascists, is the theory part of the praxis theory thing. The 62nd spectrum is the ability to make racist, sexist, and ableist jokes without feeling guilty about it. More broadly, the 62nd spectrum is the political correctness spectrum. The political correctness spectrum is the main difference between the SJW left and the dirtbag left. It describes how willing you are to be politically incorrect. The 63rd spectrum is why proponents of this ideology might use a slur. For example, the people on the left might use a slur because they are parts of the group that the slur refers to, or that they're just talking about the slur in general, while proponents on the right might use the slur specifically to harm the groups that they're targeting. And then more near the center right, you have people who are just using it because they're free speech absolutists. The 64th spectrum is how many friends proponents of this ideology tend to have. For example, notice that no matter where the cultural and economic and statist axis goes, I still remain at 0 friends. The 65th spectrum is your desire to pick up, get the fuck out of this town, and go find some people who care about you. Oh, sorry, this is supposed to be like a broad video. The 66th spectrum is how good proponents of this ideology are spreading their ideology via memes. This is one of the most important spectrums because I, as someone who's never read a book on theory in my life, get all of my information through memes. So if your ideology can't meme, then it's basically gonna die out in like 10 years. The 67th spectrum is gamers versus non-gamers. This is actually the most important spectrum. The 68th spectrum is isolationism versus globalism. Wait, why did it take me so long to get to an actual spectrum again? Like, this one's real. Isolationists want to cut off all ties to other nations, while globalists have only the best intentions. The 69th spectrum is how much proponents of this ideology fuck! Yeah! That's right, we're talking about the sex number. Ooh! On one end of the spectrum, we have virgin beta centrist cucks. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have anti-centrist chads who are taking all that sweet and tangy poonang for themselves. Aw yeah! The 70th spectrum is religion versus secularism. I really should have moved these up on the list so that I didn't do all the bullshit ones first. You may think that this is a simple left-wing, right-wing divide. The right wing are the pious people, and the left wing are the edgy atheists. But that's definitely not true. Religion versus secularism is an entirely different spectrum. The Nazis were entirely secular, essentially. They had disdain for religion, while the communists were the same way. But you can have a theocracy, which is right-wing, and still religiously based, so very theocratic. The 71st spectrum is colonial versus decolonial. Again, you may view this as a simple left-right divide, but that's because your brain is as small as a tiny feeble stick. There's nothing stopping a far-left regime from still being colonial. If you're thinking of leftists that oppose colonialism, this is more of a libertarian left approach, which is kind of an approach that's developed in direct response to colonialism. The 72nd spectrum is the infighting spectrum. This is how likely people with this ideology are to infight with people of the same ideology. Anything built off of individual identity is more likely to have infighting than anything else, which is why you have to crush individuality and have everybody think the same. No more infighting anymore. The 73rd axis is how much your ideology advocates for war in other countries. A high demand for war leads to jingoism, while a low demand for war leads to cuckoldry. Oh, sorry, I misread that. I mean pacifism. The 74th spectrum is dank versus normie. The 75th spectrum is Gen Z appeal versus boomer appeal. There is no way to appeal to both simultaneously, and that's a good thing. Anything that appeals to a boomer also appeals to people older than boomers, and anything that appeals to Gen Z also appeals to people younger than Gen Z. The 76th spectrum is the monarchy spectrum. Do these people want a monarchy, and if so, how much power do they want the monarchy to have? On the far end of the monarchy spectrum, you would have a monarch with absolute power. You may associate the spectrum with needing a state, but you can actually have anarcho-monarchists running around just fine. Here in Canada, we technically have a monarch, but the only thing that she's really good for is dying on this exact date. The 77th spectrum is the spectrum. This dictates how often people with this ideology are likely to make this face. The 78th spectrum is the wishy-washy spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have rigid proponents of this ideology who will never change their beliefs, no matter what happens. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have wishy-washy people who would change their beliefs to any other ideology, probably because they only joined the ideology in the first place because they thought they could find a group of people who actually liked them, but they actually couldn't find that because they'll never find that. So they just switch ideologies, looking for a group of people that they belong to. And they just don't realize that they don't belong, period. The 79th spectrum is the punitive versus rehabilitative justice spectrum. On the punitive end of the spectrum, you have people who think that punishments for criminals should be harsh. And on the rehabilitative spectrum, you have people proposing wacky ideas like maybe criminals can change and maybe we should be investing more into mental health services for them so that they can rehabilitate. The 80th spectrum is the climate change spectrum. Because nobody over the age of 30 or with an IQ over 30 still denies climate change, it's just levels of thinking about it. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who think about it a lot, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who don't think about it at all. Now, sure, you could think about it a lot, but then what would you be doing? You'd just be living in a constant state of fear and dread. What's best to do is repress your grief about the dying planet and just pretend that it's not happening. Once global collapse sets in, you'll probably think, dang, maybe I should have been preparing for this. But it won't matter at that point, because then you'll be dead. The 81st spectrum is the centrist sympathizer spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have people who might be extremists themselves, but still empathize with centrists. And of course, centrists typically empathize with centrists. Though I guess it would technically be possible to be like a centrist who didn't sympathize with centrists like at all. My intersectional friends would call that internalized extremarchy. On the other end of the spectrum, we have anti-centrists who want to burn the fence down. Centrist sympathizers might mean well, but ultimately they still have to get the bullet. The 82nd spectrum is tolerance towards opposing ideas. Leftists are typically intolerant towards fascist ideas, right-wingers are typically intolerant towards communist ideas, and centrists are typically intolerant towards both. The 83rd spectrum is the constructivist versus essentialist spectrum. Constructivists, they think that things are how they are because the environment around them shaped them that way. And essentialists say that things are how they are because they just are that way. They were created that way, they were born that way. That's pretty abstract, so let me make it more concrete. Constructivists are more in favor of rehabilitative justice because they think that a criminal is only a criminal because the environment that created the criminal. An essentialist thinks the criminal was born a criminal, and we should just throw them in jail forever because they're probably not going to change. Once a criminal, always a criminal. The same thing goes for broader issues like capitalism. A constructivist might say capitalism is just a byproduct of, its environment, and we could remove it and replace it with something else. An essentialist would say capitalism is there because capitalism needs to be there, and it's completely necessary. The 84th spectrum is small g genocide potential. By small g genocide, I mean all the kinds of genocide that aren't ethnically based. This includes classicide, politicide, all the other kinds of side. For example, authoritarian communism is very high in classicide potential. Eat the rich. The 85th spectrum is big G genocide potential. This is the potential for ethnic cleansing on a mass scale. Think racially motivated fascism. The 86th spectrum is the irony spectrum. This is how ironic the ideology is, or how ironic the person who believes in the ideology is. The 87th spectrum is reactionary versus non-reactionary. Non-reactionary ideologies exist independently from what's going on with other ideologies, while reactionary ideologies kind of flare up in response to other ideologies gaining strength. The 88th spectrum is the kind of reactionary ideology. So, for example, left-wing reactionary ideologies flare up in response to right-wing ideologies, and right-wing reactionary ideologies flare up in response to left-wing ideologies. But what I'm really concerned about here is the reactionary centrist kind of ideology. See, reactionary centrists are something that we've really overlooked in our political discourse, but they're people who view too much polarization on both sides. So they position themselves, they abandon all their morals, all their values, and they position themselves in the dead center between two extremes because they view themselves as mending a broken system and creating bipartisanship change and keeping people together. These people are the worst of them all, we gotta get rid of them. The 89th spectrum is the practical versus idealist spectrum. How practical is this ideology when put into practice? Is it more of a thought experiment that it better exists in your mind than in the real world? The 90th and 91st spectrum are the evil versus good and chaotic versus lawful spectrums. It's just a D&D alignment chart. The 92nd spectrum is the Palestine versus Israel spectrum. Remember, there's only one answer. The 93rd spectrum is how happy I am when I realize that I have to still edit all this video after all this filming. It's 0. The 94th spectrum is how likely proponents of this political ideology are to talk about this ideology instead of doing any actual politics. The 95th spectrum is the classic Fortnite versus Minecraft dichotomy. I know that joke was lazy and unfunny, I'm just trying to kill time. The 96th spectrum is revolutionary versus non-revolutionary. Does your ideology need the current system to collapse entirely in order for it to be built? The 97th spectrum is the metaphorical penis size of the people who are in this ideology. The 98th spectrum is, okay, I'm out of ideas. I'm out. I don't... The 98th spectrum is the pencil spectrum. It's how many pencils the people in the ideology have. I didn't talk about multiculturalism versus assimilationism, did I? Oh shit. Oh man, yeah, I mentioned that like a bunch of times and I just like completely glossed over it. Okay, this isn't actually a real spectrum. On the multiculturalism end of the spectrum, we have people who want people to keep their own diverse cultures while they're integrating with a community, or just in general, globally, keep their own cultures. The assimilationist spectrum wants those cultures to merge with the culture. For example, if an immigrant comes into America, they want the immigrant to become a staunch red-blooded American with red-blooded American values. While multiculturalists would be like, okay, well, you can still keep your religion, you can keep your language, it's okay for you to keep all those things. An assimilationist would be like, you're speaking English, you're adopting our values, etc., etc. The unitary versus federal spectrum dictates where you want power to be concentrated. Do you want it to be concentrated more locally or more broadly? The democracy spectrum dictates who gets a say in determining how the system turns out. So in the far authoritarian quadrant, you have maybe just a couple people, maybe sometimes even just one person deciding everything. And then on the far left of the spectrum, you have every single individual having an equal say in what goes on, which is how we like to believe our democracy works, but is definitely not how our democracy works. And that's it. You have a personality now. Congratulations! Now you may ask why I did this. why I spent 3 full days writing, filming, and editing this video. After all, maybe there's no real reason to be putting political ideologies on all these kinds of charts. Maybe it's just a way of making us feel more individualized and special. Maybe the whole point of politics is finding ways that we're similar to our political allies instead of finding more differences. Maybe this whole structure that I just built is made up by some guy on the internet who has no credentials, who's just pretending to know what he's talking about. Maybe this boy is just fed up with an American-centric view on politics based on a two-party system that makes everyone call leftists liberals and make fascists have to pretend to be conservatives. Maybe this boy is just trying to encourage new forms of political thought. Maybe this boy is just using ambiguity to profit off a culture war. Maybe with the loss of God and community, we've turned more and more to politics instead. Maybe I'm saying maybe a lot because I genuinely don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer to any of those questions. Maybe we should just sit in that uncertainty and become sad, lonely, and disconnected like me. Bye!